Today we're being inundated with sequels. It's not always a terrible thing, there have been some incredible sequels released over the years. However, something that is becoming more and more common is the notion that everything needs to be a franchise. We're losing this single, solitary experience. Some movies are designed to be one and done. There's nothing more to tell, and they don't need sequels, and definitely, for the love of God, don't need prequels. Over the years, there were some movies that were initially intended to be standalone features that had their endings changed in order to leave the door open for sequels. Needless to say, with all of these, I need to spoil the ending, so be aware of that while I'm discussing each film. The Descent. The Descent's a 2005 horror film written and directed by Neil Marshall. It's about a group of women who go cave diving when something goes wrong, and not only are they trapped underground, but they're also being stalked and killed by something that's living in the caves. As the movie progresses, each of the women are either picked off by the monsters or die from a cave-related accident. Finally, in the end, the lead character Sarah escapes the cave. Or does she? In the original ending, Sarah escapes and makes it back to her car where she sees the ghost of Juno, one of her friends who died in the caves. She's then jolted awake to realize that she's still in the cave. She sees her daughter holding a birthday cake with 5 candles, which represents each friend who died. She then adds a 6th candle representing Sarah. It pans back and we see she's hallucinating. The candles are really her torch, which is slowly burning out, and the cave dwellers are moving in for the kill. They then roll the credits over the picture from the beginning, implying that no one survived. It's a brilliantly bleak ending. You had the bait and switch of thinking she made it out, only for the absolute gut punch to find out that she didn't. The film was released in the UK before it was released in the US. In the UK, they used the original ending. For the US, the distributor was worried that audiences wouldn't like the, quote, uber hopeless ending, despite the fact that the film in its current form was receiving major acclaim for its bold and very brave choices. Neil Marshall had toyed with a few different endings when he was making the film, but the studio decided that in order to appeal to the US audience, as well as leave the door open for a sequel, they did this. The ending is largely the same, except when Sarah gets back to her car and sees the ghost of Juno, it ends there. It immediately cuts to the credits. They removed those last few minutes of the film, which made it so that this part wasn't a hallucination, so she actually escaped from the caves and survived. It undercut the emotional impact of the original ending. Instead of having a multi-layered finale where you have the rug pulled out from under you, it's reduced to nothing more than a cheap jump scare. Beyond that, it removed the notion that the monsters may have just been in Sarah's head. The title for the film was an intentional metaphor. This was a descent into the earth, but was also Sarah's descent into madness. Sarah loses her family in the beginning of the film, and her friends take her on this cave diving trip as a way to restore their friendship and hopefully return her to the land of the living. It's hinted at, but never explicitly said that Sarah snapped and really was the one doing all the killing. It's left ambiguous as to where either idea could be true. The studio took the US cut as canon and moved ahead with the sequel, The Descent 2, with a new writer and director. Shauna McDonald returned as Sarah, and most of the original cast came back for flashbacks. By comparison, the sequel is trash. It's all the things the original wasn't. Jump scares, stupid characters, and they can't stop showing the monsters. By doing this, they removed the ambiguity of the original and made it abundantly clear that the monsters were real and not in Sarah's head. Escape Room. Escape Room is a 2019 horror thriller from director Adam Robitel. With the rising popularity of escape rooms and the continued success of the Saw franchise, the studio decided to merge the two ideas, and it made for a very entertaining horror thriller. A group of people down on their luck are invited to try this new escape room. Whoever makes it to the end gets a prize of $10,000. The problem is, the escape room is an insane series of traps, and it's designed so that nobody lives to make it to the end. The whole thing feels like a mixture of Saw and Cube, two other movies that weren't initially franchises. In the original ending, Zoe goes back to her dorm room where she finds a clue that leads her to a classroom at her school. In a desk, she finds a check for $10,000, her reward for winning, as well as her mother's pendant, implying that Minos, the shadow organization behind the escape rooms, had something to do with her mother's death. She's then locked in the room and learns a new game has begun that she has to survive alone. It ends on this cliffhanger, implying that she most likely won't make it, and even if she does, Minos will never let her be free. Test audiences didn't like it. They wanted an ending where Zoe and Ben were a couple working together to try to stop Minos. So they shot a new ending where the duo meet up and discuss the future. Zoe tells Ben she's uncovered Minos' headquarters in New York and asks him to join her. They then show that Minos is doing R&D on the next escape room, which will be the plane that Zoe and Ben are supposed to be on. It's a somewhat overly elaborate and ridiculous ending. Instead of leaving it where Zoe wanted to get on with her life but couldn't, it now shows she was taking the fight to Minos, who we find out have resources that are borderline absurd. It's one thing to have a building that has various traps in it. It's another that they can set up an airplane as a giant flying trap just to get rid of one or two people. The logistics involved make it really hard to suspend your disbelief. This also plays into the sequel because while they don't get on the plane, they have traps where the setup just boggles the mind, like getting a group of former champions to all converge on the exact same train car at the same time. The sequel was of course left open for another one, but it didn't do as well as the first, so it's unclear if the series will continue. Final Destination. Final Destination is a horror film from director James Wong. It's about a high school student named Alex who's going on a class trip to Paris. While on the plane, he has a premonition that it's going to explode. He freaks out and gets taken off the plane along with some of his classmates and a teacher. The plane explodes like he saw in his vision, and then in the coming days, each one of the survivors dies under a mysterious circumstance. In the original ending, Alex was supposed to die. He sacrifices himself to save Claire, who, unknown to him, was pregnant with their son. In the end, Claire names the baby Alex and talks to Carter about how since he broke the chain as well as brought in a new life, they were able to cheat death. After test screenings, the audiences said that they didn't care about the love story between Alex and Claire. They were more interested in the elaborate death sequences. The studio then mandated changes which upset and saddened writer and producer Glenn Morgan. He said, "We went for something a little deeper, and they just wanted to see more death." So they went back and reworked the film. They removed the love story between Alex and Claire, reshot it so that Alex lives, and ended the film on a death/cliffhanger. This way, with Alex living but Carter dying, it meant that death was still after them, and left the door open for sequels. However, all that was for naught because for one reason or another, Devon Sawa didn't return for part 2, and they killed his character off in a very lackluster way, which made him surviving the first one pointless. Audiences didn't care as the sequel went on to be a major success, raking in $90 million in its theatrical run. With this doing so well, they went full steam ahead and made more and more sequels. With each sequel, they moved further away from the slower pacing of the original and made it all about each insane, elaborate Rube Goldberg machine-style death sequence. I went back and rewatched the original, and after seeing the numerous fast-paced sequels, I was surprised to see how much slower it was. It starts off with a bang, and then the pacing gets more and more intense. The sequels start off with a bang, and then just rush to get to the next death as quickly as possible. Although credit where it's due, that car crash from part 2 is terrifying. The last entry, Final Destination 5, didn't do as well as they were hoping, and with each sequel becoming more and more expensive, the series was put on hold. In 2019, they announced a soft reboot of the series that was delayed due to COVID, but now seems to be back on track and is supposed to focus on EMTs and first responders. Paranormal Activity. Paranormal Activity is a 2007 found-footage horror film from director Aaron Pele. It's about Katie and Mika, a couple who are living together. Katie tells Mika about a demon that's been tormenting her since she was a child, so Mika sets up cameras to try to get some evidence. The movie was shown at various film festivals and started to generate a fair amount of buzz. Despite this, they were having some trouble finding a distributor. DVDs of the film were sent to numerous studios, and after some time, it caught the attention of Jason Blum, who at the time was working at Miramax as a senior executive. He worked with the director to make some changes to the film to improve the pacing. One of the DVDs found its way to DreamWorks and onto the desk of Steven Spielberg. DreamWorks' initial idea was to acquire the rights to the film and then give it a big-budget remake. Blum and Pele knew the film was something special, and as part of their contract agreement was that there be a test screening of the original, unaltered film before jumping into a remake. During the test screening, audience members started leaving. The executives panicked, thinking that the film was bombing, when it was the opposite. People were leaving because they were terrified. That was when the idea of a remake was scrapped. Although in pure Hollywood fashion, they couldn't leave well enough alone. The screening had the original ending, which is what had been shown at the various festivals up to this point. In this ending, Katie is fully possessed by the demon and kills Mika off-screen. She then goes upstairs and waits. The police arrive after a neighbor called about a disturbance, and when they come upstairs, they see Katie holding the knife that she used to kill Mika. Confused, she staggers towards them, and in one last turn of the screw, the demon slams the door behind the cops, which startles them, and they shoot her dead. It's a brilliantly staged ending that totally caps off all the events in the film. Spielberg thought the ending needed more punch, since apparently the two leads dying tragically wasn't good enough. He said he wanted to leave the audience with a big jolt. Paranormal Activity cost $15,000 to make. Paramount, the owners of DreamWorks, bought the domestic rights to the film and the worldwide rights to any sequels for $350,000, and then gave them an additional $200,000 to go back and do some reshoots, including a new ending. They shot 2 new endings. The first was Katie looking into the camera and then slitting her throat with the knife she used to kill Mika. The other was the one they went with, the Spielberg-suggested ending. She throws Mika's body and then stares into the camera. Her face morphs into a demon and she jumps at the audience. This changed a few things about the movie. Now, Katie lived through the events so they could bring her back for sequels, which they did. This also left the audience with a scare, although if you dissect it, it makes no sense. Why would the demon lunge at the camera, other than to give the audience a jump scare? It breaks the fourth wall and deflates any of the tension the film had been building up. It betrays the entire film that you just watched because up to this point, it was all about sound design and effectively drawn-out scares. To end on a cheap jump scare was, well, cheap. Pele stated that he made the movie the way he did to focus on believability, but this new ending went against his original intentions. The film was being shown at festivals in 2007, but due to some internal issues with DreamWorks, it wasn't released into mainstream theaters until 2009. Paranormal Activity did go on to be a huge success, raking in almost $200 million worldwide, making it one of the most profitable films in history. Although for me, that's kind of frustrating because most of the buzz for the film was from the folks who saw the original ending. The Spielberg-suggested ending was taking an overwhelmingly bleak ending and changing it into something that is 100% Hollywood, all just so you can make a few teenagers jump. Now instead of walking out of the theater scared, most were laughing, because they killed the overwhelming sense of dread with a tension breaker. Imagine if they pulled this with the Blair Witch Project, where instead of the camera falling over and the film running out, they have a scary witch face jump at the lens. This is similar to what they did a few years later with another Blumhouse film, Sinister, where the original ending was a slow fade-out that they changed to have Bagul jump at the audience to break the tension. I did a whole video about this a while ago when Blumhouse was doing this every other film. Thankfully, they don't do that anymore. When they released Paranormal Activity on home video, they included the throat-slitting ending as an alternate ending, but didn't include the original. It wasn't until many years later when they finally included that as a bonus feature. Although that was from a limited edition version that was only available in the UK unless you imported it. To my knowledge, there still isn't a home video version with the original ending that's been released in the US. Considering they've re-released the film numerous times over the years, it's possible it might be on one of them, but I can't check out every single disc. The original Paranormal Activity, in my humble opinion, is one of the scariest films of all time. The Paramount version takes a great film and shoots itself in the foot with a lame ending. Sadly, most people aren't even aware of the original ending. With the changes, the film was ripe for sequels, and as of currently, there are 7 movies, although Katie is only in the first 5. There's also a non-canon spin-off, Paranormal Activity 2, Tokyo Night. Paranormal Activity The Other Side is set to release sometime later in 2023 on Paramount+. Just to reiterate at the end here, I don't hate sequels. Some of my favorite movies are sequels. I also don't mind franchises. I'm just tired of perfectly good standalone films that are altered, either in an attempt to please the mythical larger audience, or for the sake of sequels. Back in the day, they'd make a movie as a standalone product, and then if it was a hit, they'd figure out a way to make sequels. Now we're so focused on making everything a franchise that movies will often start out as part 1 in a series, or they'll force drastic changes to either make it possible for sequels, Or in the case of something like 10 Cloverfield Lane, they completely redo chunks of the film to shoehorn it into a franchise. Oh, and don't get me started on concepts that are stretched out into a 10-episode streaming series, when they would have made a perfectly good 2-hour movie. Down with cinematic universes too, but that's a topic for another video. What I'm trying to say here is, maybe Hollywood can cut back on the sequels. We're being inundated with a non-stop barrage of the same stories. This is without even touching on things like remakes and reboots, which there is also too many of. Yes, I understand the changes made to these and other films, for the most part, went on to make the studios millions of dollars. As of 2023, 13 of the 20 highest-grossing films of all time have been sequels, and you can argue that The Avengers and Black Panther can be added since they're part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's less risky for studios to take chances on established brands. Hollywood not wanting to invest in new ideas is how we end up with a movie that no one was really asking for, like Legally Blonde 3. Most of the new movie ideas you see these days are ones the studio decided would be the start of a new franchise, instead of just a standalone film, regardless of how unnecessary it may be. So while you may be excited for more from a franchise you're familiar with, think of all the films that won't be made because the studios were too busy funneling all their capital into movies like Toy Story 4, or Indiana Jones 5, or Pirates of the Caribbean 6. This is good for studios in the short term, but bad for filmmaking and audiences in the long run. Franchise fatigue is real. Eventually, audiences will tire of a brand no matter how much money you dump into it. When that happens, they'll probably wish they had some standalone films in the pipeline, instead of a pile of $100 million flops they'd sooner bury than release.
Don't talk to me. You scared the hell out of me.